Welcome to the Overseas Development Institute tonight. We are really delighted to have you all here for what I think is going to be an important and extremely interesting event. My name is Alex Thier. I'm the Executive Director here at ODI, and our event tonight is called Investing to Transform Lives. And I also welcome those of you who are not in the room with us, but watching around the world on live stream. And if you are in the room or somewhere else and you want to follow or contribute to the discussion on Twitter, we are using the hashtag, it's up there in little letters, GlobalDev. So our long journey as a species on this planet has hit two milestones simultaneously, but probably not coincidentally. We as a generation have the opportunity, as the first generation in history, to end extreme poverty, to create a world in which every person, no matter where they are born or how they are born or what they look like when they're born, has the opportunity to live a life of basic human dignity. And at the same time, we are the first generation to confront what may be a global existential crisis. So, to address these problems, we need leadership and political will. We need inclusive growth that does not destroy the planet. And we need creative and effective solutions. We need evidence of what works, where, and why. And we need resources. So we are here tonight to talk about that combination of things, and particularly how those resources can be brought together to achieve those objectives. 2 years ago, the world set about to agreeing on a new set of development goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. And what we know right now, if we're going to achieve those together, there is currently a $2.5 trillion per year financing gap. So where are those resources going to come from? How are we collectively going to catalyze not only those resources, but the use of them to accomplish the Sustainable Development Goals? So what makes this conversation also really special tonight is that we will be launching the CDC's new 5-year strategy, and with it, its new CEO. But we'll come to that in a minute. Yes, launching you. Your meteoric rise onto the world stage. But to kick us off, we have a very special guest tonight, Lord Bates, the Minister of State in the UK Department for International Development. A member of the House of Lords, and very recently come from the House of Lords, maybe he'll talk about that. Lord Bates was appointed as a Minister of State at DFID in October of 2016. And before that, very interestingly, served as a Minister of State in the Home Office for the year prior to that. Lord Bates, we are grateful that you have taken your time to join us here tonight, and so we're going to start this event with you. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all of you in the room and all of you who are listening virtually. Many of the people and organizations in this room are people who we partner with on a week-in, week-out basis to help eradicate poverty around the world. And these are always great opportunities to say thank you for all that you do. You are often operating in some of the most dangerous parts of the world with limited protection. And you are doing it with great heart and passion, and we appreciate you and applaud you for what you are doing. So thank you indeed. I'm delighted to be here this evening on such an important day because it's a question of how we can use development, investing alongside the private sector to increase the pace of inclusive growth and economic transformation in developing countries to achieve the UN global goals. DFID is rightly recognised for its leading role in responding to humanitarian disasters and working with government and non-government partners to improve access to better schooling, better healthcare for the poorest in countries. But in order to lift the huge numbers of people out of grinding poverty, we need to help support sustained job creation in developing countries. This is what developing countries want. This is what they and we in the international system need to help deliver. It is as a large part of how we will help countries to achieve the global goals agreed in 2015 and move beyond the need for aid. I'm pleased to be here on the day that CDC are launching their new 5-year strategic framework. As the UK's development finance institution, CDC is central to our approach to economic development. The new strategy reflects on our CDC and DFID shared ambitions for the organisation to be at the forefront of development finance thinking and practice, playing a critical role within the wider context of how Her Majesty's government works to boost global prosperity and tackle the causes of poverty. If you look at the world today, faltering growth and rising youth populations have exposed a chronic need for jobs and better opportunities. Most developing countries are not growing fast enough or industrializing fast enough to leave poverty behind. Over the next decade, 1 billion or more young people will enter the jobs market, mainly in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. Africa's population is set to double by 2050, and as many as 18 million extra jobs a year will be needed. Failure to consign a generation to a future where jobs and opportunities are always out of reach, potentially fueling instability and mass migration, has direct consequences for Britain. The additional financing needed to achieve the UN global goals, as Alex has mentioned, by 2030, is a staggering $2.5 trillion every year. And therefore, there needs to be a point of humility within the international community that we cannot do this alone. We need to be operating smarter. We need to be operating as a catalyst. As the UN made clear, much of this finance needs to come from the private sector. This needs international action. Together we must create an unprecedented increase in the number and quality of jobs in poor countries and the level of private investment to enable businesses to grow and prosper and support better infrastructure, technology, connectivity, and skilled and healthy workforce. So what's DFID doing? Earlier this year, we had our own strategy launch. Our first ever economic development strategy sets out how we will invest to support inclusive economic growth in the poorest regions through a range of measures. Building the potential for developing countries to trade with the UK and the rest of the world. Technical partnerships with partner governments to tackle the constraints, policy, legal, regulatory, institutional, that deter investors and prevent business growth. Developing local financial sectors and deepening links with the City of London. Pioneering investments in businesses to create jobs, catalyse private sector investment, and build markets in the most challenging settings. We believe it's not enough for us to invest in improvements in girls' education. In order to escape poverty, she needs both a better education and a better job at the end of it. This needs collective action, as I mentioned. In March, we held a joint conference with the World Bank in London, Transforming Investment Risk, looking at how the international community and investors can come together to overcome the barriers that currently deter investment capital from flowing into those countries that so desperately need it, to address the risks and to create opportunities. Following that successful event, there is now a growing momentum amongst the key stakeholders, multilaterals, DFIs, investors, including the City of London, to make a concerted action on this billions to trillions agenda. CDC has a core pioneering role to play in furthering this agenda. CDC is one of a handful of investors with the skills and the risk appetite to successfully support businesses in the most difficult and challenging of markets, where private investors won't go alone. The very markets in Sierra Leone, in the DRC, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, where jobs and economic opportunities are most desperately needed to help bring stability and give people a stake in their own future. It is here that CDC uses its expertise and capital to create effect, making infrastructure projects happen that would otherwise remain unfunded, building stronger businesses that create jobs, generate taxes, and bring new products and services to market, helping crowd in private finance by demonstrating to other investors that responsible investments in difficult places can be viable. You'll hear from Nick O'Donoghue shortly, and I don't want to steal his thunder, but as the CDC shareholder, the key objectives we have had in our discussions with CDC on their new strategy were centered around these three things. Firstly, ensuring that the new strategy builds on success and the strong results achieved by CDC already. In the last 3 years, 2014 to 16, companies backed by CDC in Africa and South Asia have created over 3 million new direct and indirect jobs and paid taxes into national governments worth $9 billion. This is impressive, and it must continue. Secondly, I'm glad to say that this is a strategy that continues the direction set in 2012, namely by continuing geographical focus on the poorest and most fragile countries and states in Africa and South Asia, and targeting sectors that create the largest number of jobs. Thirdly, the new strategy sets out a new ambition, taking CDC to the next level, taking on more risk to unlock more impact, maximising its development impact through the new and broader framework, and improving its transparency and accountability. For me, this is all extremely exciting. It is these strong foundations, the track record of results, combined with the ambition to do more, that energises me as a minister looking at CDC's new strategy in the context of today's urgent needs. So to conclude, advancing economic development in the poorest countries is a hallmark of building global Britain. Economic development is an essential part of how Britain is helping to make globalisation work for all, and furthering our national interests by playing a leading role on the international stage. The new strategy from CDC marks an important moment and launches a new determination in the fight against poverty, ensuring that CDC remains a pioneering DFI, delivering impact and value for money. It responds to important issues raised by stakeholders, including during the passage of the CDC bill earlier this year, on development impact, transparency and accountability. Let me finish by saying a huge thank you to all those in this room and elsewhere who've helped to shape and develop this new strategy. This includes my own department, our partners, the NGO communities, investors, investees, the academic community, especially here at ODI, and the helpful scrutiny it received from the National Audit Office, civil society, from Parliament, and from my fellow parliamentarians. CDC's mission, and its strategy is to achieve that mission, is as important today as it was in 1948. And it's probably right to remind ourselves as to what that was. It was, and is, to create jobs and to make a lasting difference to people's lives in some of the world's poorest places. Thank you.
Maybe I'll just ask you one question before you sit down and we move to the next part of the conversation.
Right.
So I think you've in your speech you've spoken very eloquently about one of the important trends that has occurred with the last strategy and this strategy is the geographic concentration and the move towards greater focus in investing in fragile environments. And that, of course, as you also said, raises risk. It raises risk for the investments that the CDC will be making. I'm curious if you could reflect a little bit, as you mentioned, both national interest and why this is important for the UK, and as a member of Parliament, how do you think about how do we move forward in being able to say that it's okay to take risk and that it's in fact necessary if we're going to achieve these goals, when taking risk means that you will end up with probably some more failures as well?
Well, it's a great question, Alex, and it's one that we do sort of ponder with, particularly in the present climate, which seems to be very intolerant of risk. But it's also very important that we recognise that we don't duplicate what countries should and are doing for themselves, what the private sector can and should be doing itself in spotting opportunities. This needs to be in addition to that. Otherwise, it's not development from our standpoint. And that's the reason why we narrowed the focus in 2012 to say we wanted to really focus on the most difficult of markets, not to kind of go for the headlines where we can generate a good return by, as it were, crowding out investment which could have been made by other organisations. It's to be in the difficult places. It's to be in the hard places. That's why we've incorporated into this strategy a new fragility index, which is looking again at the most difficult places to actually do work. And I think it's very important to communicate a fact about DFID's work, that sometimes people kind of look at financial institutions and they look at DFIs and they perhaps think that with their links to high finance, that some element of the heart and the passion goes out of this. But listen, day to day, DFID's work is all about that aim of eradicating extreme poverty by 2030. That's what we're about. That's why last week I was in South Sudan. That's why last week the Secretary of State was in Ethiopia and Somalia. That's why Rory Stewart was in northeast Nigeria. This is where our heart is. This is where our passion is. That's why we're hosting the Family Planning Summit, because we know how important that is here in London next week. So we have to, in some senses, we have to steel ourselves to be, of course, responsible, which is why the strategy is there and why the track record is there, but also to be courageous. And courageous not on behalf of our own self-interest, but courageous on behalf of our ambition for the world's poor.
Thank you very much. Thanks in particular for your passion and commitment and taking the personal risks that you're taking as well to make it. So Nick O'Donoghue is the new CEO of the CDC. He comes from a fascinating background of high finance as well as all kinds of mixed finance. I think like the development community as a whole, Nick has traveled a fascinating path increasingly towards looking at how we use the tools of finance to help the world to become a better place. As the founding CEO, I believe, of Big Society Capital, you've been doing some really interesting and innovative stuff, and I think people are really excited about what you're going to do next. So congratulations and welcome.
Great, thank you, Alex. Thank you, Lord Bates. Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I am, as Alex said, the new CEO of CDC, and this is my first. I'm not sure I'd describe it as a launch, but it is my first. It is my first formal appearance in that capacity. So it's fortuitous that would coincide with the launch of our new 5-year strategy. I'm also happy that I'm joined tonight by our chairman, Graham Wrigley, who's sitting in the front row and will join us for questions later on. Number of members of our board. And importantly, a number of members of our senior management team, and those people who have been most, I think, instrumental in putting together the document that you have on your chairs. So I have been CEO now at CDC for all of about 3 weeks. However, I did have the opportunity before I sort of took the hot seat to spend about 2 months traveling broadly in Africa and India, and South Asia, and in many of the regions in which we are active. And I had the opportunity to meet with many of the companies that we've invested in, many of the managers that we use, many of the other stakeholders that are involved with the CDC's work. And I suppose my reflection on that trip and those visits is, first of all, that it's just an enormous privilege to be the chief executive of an organization like CDC that has made such an important contribution to development in all of these countries, really since 1948. But also that it's a really important and exciting time to take over the leadership of this organization. And it's important for many of the reasons that Lord Bates gave you. It is, there's probably never been a time where the private sector, economic development, job creation have been so central to the debate in global development. And I think that's a function of the launch of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a function of the financing conference in Addis. It's a function of COP21 in Paris. And all of these have come to a common idea that focuses on the importance of the private sector and the importance on catalyzing private sector capital flows if we're to have any chance at all of achieving those development goals. And as Lord Bates said, we all know that no country's ever really escaped poverty without a thriving private sector. So a private sector that can pay taxes, provide quality jobs, build infrastructure, help support the development of public services. We also know, as Lord Bates says, there's 1 billion young people who will come into the labour force in Asia and Africa over the next 10 years. And those young people are going to need jobs. And the vast majority of those jobs will have to be provided by private sector companies. Now, it's an exciting time to come to CDC, first and foremost, because of what the organization has achieved in the last 5 years. And you know, my predecessor, Diana Noble, who I'm sure many of you have met and listened to, used to talk about CDC's role as doing the hardest investments in the hardest places. And that is exactly what the organization have been doing over the last 5 years. And I wanted to show you just 2 very quick slides which illustrate that. The first one shows where our portfolio was based in 2012 when we made that radical shift in strategy. In that year, our portfolio was distributed across most of what we would now describe as emerging markets. In that year, in our core markets, we invested £169 million. Today, all our investment activity is focused in those core markets of Africa and South Asia. Our commitments in that region last year were £1.1 billion. So there's a huge increase. So you've got a huge increase in focus, and you've also got a huge increase in the amount of money that we've been able to invest in those regions. So I think the most important thing to say about our new strategy is that there's a lot about our old strategy that isn't going to change, and we're not going to change our focus on investing only in Asia and Africa. We're going to continue to invest principally in fragile and conflict states. Last year, 44% of our investments went to fragile states. That, by the way, is about twice what our peer group, our peer organizations in the development finance community invest in those countries. And we'll continue, as Lord Bates said, to prioritize job creation and to focus on the highest job creating sectors. So that's all going to be as it was. I think, though, what's really obviously exciting for me coming as a new chief executive to this job is to try to play some part in helping the organization build on that foundation and also evolve into an even more effective development institution. And this strategy lays out a number of different ways that we're going to try to do that. And the first of those is how we really think about impact, how we measure it, how we monitor it. And jobs will always, as they should with any organization that's focused on economic development, jobs will always remain completely central to the work that we do. But you know, as I said, had the opportunity to travel in the last couple of months, I really was struck as I visited many of the companies just to see how much impact that our investments were having over and above just job creation. And so I visited, for example, a company called Mkopa in Kenya that now supply solar panels to 400,000 households in that country. So now we've got 400,000 more households that can light their homes at night, 400,000 more households that can charge their mobile phones, can listen to the radio, and can replace the kerosene that they've been using to light their homes up to now. I visited a company called Kampuji in Malawi. We're running a training academy to teach smallholder farmers how to breed chickens and so that they can earn incremental income. We're going to show you a video between me finishing speaking and the Q&A. We'll show you a short video about a company called Miro Forestry in Sierra Leone, which creates a lot of jobs, as you'll see, but also significant positive environmental impacts. So as we think about our investment process, we're going to need to think much more broadly about the impact we're creating. We have the opportunity to be much more specific and on some metrics that we can aggregate, so areas like gender and climate and taxes paid, so you'll see more numbers on those. We'll be much more specific within sectors. It's difficult to aggregate, as we all know, impact metrics across a whole range of different activities. But within sectors, you can come a long way towards identifying specific metrics and specific indicators that you can follow and judge and benchmark your impact against. For every investment that we make, we'll be articulating a clear investment thesis, which we will publish. We will put on our website along the details of the transaction. We will monitor it, and we will report on it. We'll continue to fund research that looks at the broader story of impact within many of these sectors. And some of you, I know, joined us about a week ago at Imperial College when we launched a report on the impact of private sector health. And the report didn't just focus on the number of jobs that are created, even though that is a significant job creating sector, but it focused much more broadly on patient experience, quality of care, patient access, but also, in addition, it focused on the ecosystem. And what effect does a private hospital have on the broad health ecosystem? And what effect does it have in a positive way in terms of training, but also what effect does it have in a negative way in terms of potentially taking doctors and nurses out of the public system? So you're going to see a lot more of that type of work from us over the next 5 years. So that's the first, I think, really significant evolution, is this focus on telling a much broader and more detailed impact story. The second one is around how much, and it's relevant to the question that Alex asked, it's about how much risk we're going to be taking and how much innovation we can really do. And we're very fortunate now to have an opportunity to be much more innovative about how we identify sectors. And there's a whole lot of sectors that today are too risky for mainstream finance, have significant developmental potential, and also have the ability or the potential to evolve over the next sort of 3, 4, 5 years into sectors in which commercial finance can flow. But somebody needs to go first, and somebody needs to demonstrate the viability, take the risk to demonstrate the viability of those investments. So that's very specifically what CDC will be trying to do more of in the next 5 years. And we have a number of strategies which are listed in the report. Off-grid solar, and our role and our opportunity in off-grid solar is to provide local currency finance, local currency debt to solar developers in many countries in Africa, which today is not available. Transmission and distribution, power transmission and distribution in Africa is a sector that's had almost no investment in the recent past. So we want to start investing money there again to demonstrate that it can have significant impact, but can also be investable for others. We're going to be launching a volume guarantee program, which is something I was familiar with from my days as an advisor to the Gates Foundation, which will stimulate, we hope, the development of vital drugs and vaccines for diseases, against diseases in Africa. So there's a whole range of different things and different activities that we think we can be involved in, which heretofore have been considered, frankly, too risky for many development finance institutions, including CDC. And I think more than anything, if I think about how our impact will be measured, how our influence will be measured over the next 5 years, it's our ability to do these, to develop these more risky investments, and to show that over time they can become more investable, attract private capital. And so when people look back at it, when we're 5 years from now, when we're launching our next strategy, I hope that we'll be able to point to a whole series of different areas where our capital has been the first mover capital that has helped develop these areas. Thirdly, I think we need to mobilize more capital. This is not just about CDC. We've probably got more experience and more data than almost anybody else in investing in the markets in which we invest. We sit here in the world's leading financial center, and I know from my work in the impact investment community just how much appetite there is in mainstream financial institutions to start investing in support of the SDGs. And frankly, nobody's better placed than CDC is to champion that work. And nobody's better placed to act as a partner to ensure these investments are made in a thoughtful way and in a way which has development right front and center. So we'll be doing a lot more within the financial community to encourage and help, and hopefully attract more capital outside of just ours to what we're investing in. And finally, I think it's also important for us to continue to try to be more transparent. And we need to also ensure that we're partnering effectively with all our stakeholders. And one of the key lessons that I learned when I was at Big Society Capital was just how valuable our partnership with civil society was. And those organizations, and I know many of you represent in this room, those organizations understand the issues that we're trying to solve oftentimes much better than we do. And there's a whole learning process that we can engage with them. So that's something, as I said, I learned when I was at BSC, and I want to make sure that we're doing that as much as we possibly can at CDC. From our side, we also intend to publish more information on the companies we invest in, why we invest, what we hope to achieve, and whether over time that we're actually doing that. So those are, I think, just some of the things. I recommend the strategy document to you. I think hopefully it gives you somewhat of a taste for what I'll be doing over the next few years. I think hopefully it comes across as an exciting but also a challenging agenda. But I think one, as we said, that is enormously important if we're going to come anywhere close to achieving the global goals. And one thing I absolutely know for sure is that this is something where we're going to need all the help we can get. And so I'm looking forward to working with everybody in this room as we try to achieve that. So thank you all. And now, as I promised, before we go to Q&A, we're going to show you a short video about Miro Forestry in Sierra Leone, which I think gives you a very good sort of feel for the type of work and impact that an organization like CDC can create.
West Africa have lost 80% of its indigenous forest. It has been ravaged by wildfire, exhausted by charcoal production, and we intend to do something about it. I'm James Fona. This is Miro Yoni Plantation, Northern Province in Sierra Leone. Plantation forestry is one step towards minimizing deforestation and combating climate change. We pick the best seed possible, and some we put in by hand and others by machine. You have to see this plant as your baby. There should be one-to-one contact, some extraordinary feeling. Now that we are seeing standing trees, standing forest is a dream come true. We have over 3 million trees and 600 employees. Employment is very important. A couple of years ago, there was no money, there was no cash flow. Things were hard.
Nei jubila sisi amelo pasimi ne casual local kasanga ko pasimi team leader odoro yere chimki bele back client bele the business investors and kodi so ne mo client to fort kododi na mo e kaka tselneki konto toko tibokulo rusku ka chimko adi fo mi ran mi ruskule ngama me o eso akal ko to encheta su Kalau pangkatan yo umi, kaka kami tanta national beli ramai. Fete romantic so di mo mine.
Most of this community, their houses were built and roofed in chats, but today they have tin roofs in their houses because of the job we have gained from this homeland. The community feel empowered. The plantation can help the environment very greatly to reduce greenhouse gases. It also helps to minimize flooding and erosion. We make sure that there's a conservation area alongside our plantation. We are going to preserve the indigenous trees. When I walk around this plantation, I feel I've contributed in developing this community. I've achieved in helping other people to gain jobs. I'm a nature worshipper, so I enjoy the greens, I enjoy the waves of the trees, the fresh air that it's producing. It's just marvelous. I truly believe that we are going to make a difference for the generations to come.
Thank you. Beautiful film. So thank you, Nick, and I want to welcome also our other two panelists. Rachel Turner is here, and she's the Interim Director General for Economic Development at DFID. Thank you for being with us tonight.
That's great, thank you.
And Daniel Hanna, who is the Global Head of Public Sector and Development Organizations at Standard Chartered Bank. Welcome, Daniel. So I'm going to ask each of you a couple of questions, and we're going to try to keep it short and lively so we have a good conversation. And then after that, we're going to go out and field some questions from the audience as well. And I want to start with you, Daniel. And the first thing I wanted to ask you, I want to kind of elicit, I think, a good news and a bad news frame from you. You were involved a couple of years ago in thinking about how to respond creatively to the Ebola crisis. And so I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about that and what you learned from that experience.
Sure, thank you, Alex. And first of all, actually, maybe I could just say a very big thank you for inviting me to this panel, and I think an excellent set of speeches from the Minister and Nick. And it's a real privilege to be here at the start of CDC's launch of its new strategy. So I was very fortunate to be part of the work that both Standard Chartered and CDC did during the Ebola crisis. And it all started from a conversation that happened at the IMF annual meetings, where we were thinking about how we could be helpful to an economy that was going through a really difficult period in terms of obviously the health crisis that was affecting it, but also the knock-on economic impacts that you were seeing. I think you had seen a situation where working capital had completely seized up, there was a lot of stress in the banking system, and companies were really struggling, I think as you heard in the video, to find ways to keep going. And together, we put together a $50 million facility that put new funds into the economy and supported a number of companies going through this period who could both take part in the relief efforts, so they were able to provide critical commodities that were required in the relief efforts themselves, and then the sort of rehabilitation post the Ebola crisis as well. And I think what was really striking about that was that we managed to do that in 8 weeks, which door to door, even for a commercial institution, is incredibly fast, and certainly for a development finance institution is very much at the speedier ends that the sector sometimes works at. And it was really down, I think, to a very dedicated set of teams on both sides. We actually managed to support, I think, about 3,300 jobs in Sierra Leone during this process, and that had a knock-on impact. I think CDC has estimated around 30,000 sort of livelihoods. And I think it provided a very needed boost at a time when the economy was going through a very dark patch.
So I want to take you from that to the wider challenge, which is that you and I were at something recently, and somebody said, which I've heard from other people as well, that in the last year there has only been financial close on one major energy project in Africa. That to me does not speak to a revolution. It speaks to a stalled challenge, a lot of enthusiasm, more players in the market, more commitments of finance, but the reality is that it's not being delivered. And so can you tell us a little bit about why you think that is and what really needs to change from CDC and others to actually unlock the financing that's going to be necessary?
Well, I guess I think I have a very lucky position because Standard Chartered, we're on the ground in lots of places in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And in my role, I speak to a lot of governments and public investors. And certainly when you talk to governments in places like Africa, there is a huge demand for new capital, new projects, big infrastructure plans. When you go speak to the investment community, and I think we all know the stats that there's $120 trillion of assets under management in the private sector. There are some $8.6 trillion at the moment invested in bonds and yielding negative in terms of their response. So surely there is a way to bring these two conversations together. And yet, as you say, it's not always happening. And I think there's sort of, I think the way as a former economist, I always think about the demand side and the supply side. So in terms of the supply of capital, I think the first issue is around sort of the difference between risk and perceived risk. For a number of years, I've been advising an infrastructure company raise money in Africa, and I've been very struck by how few investors are willing to look at African infrastructure. That's even though, if you look at the stats, African infrastructure has one of the lowest default rates in the world. It has a lower default rate than Asian infrastructure, a lower default rate than European and American infrastructure. And yet there is a risk perception out there that means that investors are put off. And I think Nick mentioned the importance of information, and I think that is really critical. In a lot of these markets, there is just not enough information for investors to get comfortable, and that means they build in a risk premium. I think the second issue around the supply is actually the constraints that investors themselves are under. So many investors can only invest in large projects. They need to spend 100 million, 200 million, 300 million at a go. They need to be able to invest in maybe an investment grade opportunity. They can't go below that. And they need to invest in dollars as opposed to local currency. And if you look on the demand side, I think one of the problems is actually there are not that many infrastructure projects that have dollar payables linked to them. So we have this big issue of demands in local currency, but effectively supplied capital in dollar currency. And then we've also got the issue about just complexity of the number of bankable projects in these markets is not that great. So I think there are something like 67 project preparation funds available in Africa. And actually the research shows the more project preparation funds you see, the actual more complicated it becomes to raise money. So actually trying to build up the pipeline of bankable projects in these markets is also a key piece. And I think it's trying to tackle both those ends at the same time, and then we'll see some real progress.
It's interesting. Well, maybe we'll come back to that. Rachel, I want to ask you, I think some people stand back and say, well, is this really the work of the development community? Obviously, not just the CDC strategy, but overall, you've put a big bet on with a new economic development strategy. I was in Uganda recently, and I saw some work that was being done by DFID to combat HIV and malaria, working on maternal health, things that literally for a few dollars can make the difference between life and death for people. And as a result of those types of investments from DFID, we have made incredible gains. It's something that we know how to do, and every one of the pounds that you take away from that to go to CDC, you've really got to know that you're going to have impact. So tell me a little bit about the theory of change that you think makes this a worthwhile set of investments.
Sure. Good questions, Alex. I mean, I think the Minister has started to answer that in his speech, and I think Nick also took us a long way in terms of answering that. Our economic development strategy that we launched earlier this year puts us firmly behind supporting the direction of travel that developing countries are keen to move on to absolutely transform their economies. And all the evidence that we really very strongly believe in shows that thriving private sectors, thriving businesses that can offer jobs to people and to young people are the best route to poverty eradication. And we feel, very firmly that developing a thriving, responsible private sector is really going to be the solution to deliver the global goals and to eradicate poverty. And that's why this strategy that we're launching today with this new approach from CDC, the patient capital, the ability to invest in the fragile markets is so important to delivering our ambition for the global goals. But at the same time, Alex, this is not all we're going to do. I mean, we're absolutely clear, and the Minister was clear just now, that we also remain firmly committed to other routes to deliver for the very poorest people. And that includes things we need to do for the poorest people so that they are confident and capable and healthy and educated and able to contribute to growth and to seize the benefits of that economic growth and to be in a position to secure those jobs. So it's a balanced approach. It's not an either or. And I think, the key issue is that we're trying to build a really comprehensive policy that has the economic transformation piece absolutely at its heart, but that we are still going to be providing grant aid. We're still going to be really strong and effective humanitarian donors. We're still going to be supporting the things we need to do in family planning, the things we need to do with neglected tropical diseases, as well as this new and exciting approach to economic transformation.
That's great. And, I think that we here at ODI spend our days and often our nights wrestling and grappling with the question of how do we know? How do we know that what we are trying to do actually has impact? One of the things, there was a report from the House of Commons earlier this year, and one of the critical points that they were making in that report was whether DFID has an effective means to evaluate CDC's performance and returns. There are some really good things in this strategy talking about how you might do that, how you might do more of it, how you might measure more things, how you might be more transparent about the outcomes. Can you just tell us a little bit about what is going to give you the comfort levels, as you said, that you have the balance right, that the investments being made are in fact delivering what is promised here?
I mean, there are lots of parts to that. The first bit is what Nick has been saying in terms of the commitment in this strategy from CDC to be absolutely clear that for every investment there's going to be what we're calling a route to impact. So for every investment, we're going to have clear what the development expectation is, and it's going to be monitored and it's going to be reported on. So there will be, for every investment, an ex ante and an ex post set of information and set of data that will tell us if we're having the impact we want to have. So that's pretty good. We are also ourselves going to be putting our own evaluation strategy alongside what CDC are doing. And that will allow us to do some really serious longitudinal work that will be able to track a whole set of issues, including issues around whether we've succeeded to mobilise investment. And Nick spoke earlier about our ambitions to really set ourselves targets and ways of working to mobilise investment from the city, from the wider private sector, and it's really important that we're able to track our impact and our success there, but we'll also be able to track the impact that we're having on people's lives, both as workers and beyond, in the sectors that we're trying to transform through the investments. So it's a lot of effort, actually, and I think it's going to be really exciting. And I think when we're sitting here, when we come, if we're all sitting here in 5 years' time, I think we're going to have a very rich set of very interesting information that we're going to be able to look and see what we achieved in the last 5 years. Yeah.
Consider the room booked. So, Nick, let me come to you. One of the biggest challenges, and you and Lord Bates both already made reference to this, that these types of investments face, is knowing that you're not just replacing what a bank would be doing anyway. Or perhaps an even more challenging assertion is that you're, by co-financing things and blending finance, that you're subsidizing what private capital would be doing anyway. So what is it in your model, and in fact in your experience, that lets you sort out where you are doing that and where you aren't, so that you can make the investments that need to happen, but not the ones that don't?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, Alex, and it gets to the whole question of additionality and whether or not the money that CDC organizations like CDC and other DFIs are providing really is additive, or whether it's just sort of effectively crowding out what would have happened anyway. And the CDC looks at additionality with sort of two lenses. The first lens is financial additionality, and it asks the question, would that money have been there? Would that fund have got set up and started? Would that project have got financed if we hadn't put our money in? And that's not just, a lot of the time, that's about being the first mover, being the first person to write the first check to say, we'll do this, that'll bring in other people. But that's clearly, that financial additionality screen is the first screen. The second screen we look at, which we call value additionality, and I'll confess that when I left from my trip to Africa and Asia, I left a little bit skeptical on the question of value additionality, because I'd heard, yes, we once we get involved in companies, we help them with all sorts of issues, environmental issues, social issues, and a whole range of issues. And I guess I left a little bit skeptical, but I came back as a complete convert, because there's absolutely no question that when you go visit the companies that have not just our money, but our sort of peer group's money, we make a significant difference to the way these organizations are run. And that is particularly true if you're an equity investor, because you're sitting there, you're at the governance table, you're on the board, and you can really help, create the change. So every investment committee that we have, we will specifically talk about not just the financial characteristics of this investment, but specifically talk about the environmental and social issues, not just as they exist today, but what is our plan over the coming years as an owner of that company? What is our plan to affect change, positive change in that company?
I'm curious, it's not just to prove that I read the strategy, but on page 35 of the strategy, you have an interesting chart that shows because you've ramped up investment and are ramping up investment significantly. And so you have this chart that shows, here come the investments, and then here come the results, but the investments we see now and the results we see later. And the combination of a big ramping up of investments and a slow, patient approach to results means that you've got an accountability lag, right? You've got a lag in your ability to be able to tell the story of where those investments are going to go. So talk to us a little bit about that, because obviously, as Lord Bates referenced, we're in an environment where people demand to understand what's going on, and so how do you think about balancing those over the next 5 years?
I think the question you're asking, Alex, is you never know whether an investment is going to be successful until you've finished with it. And many of the investments that we take on for very good reason, we need to be very patient. They take a long time. So I think the answer to that question is in the same way that you, on an ongoing basis, any investment firm will monitor what's going on in the companies and with the assets they own. So CDC monitor not just what's going on financially, but monitor on an ongoing basis what impact we're having within the company, both on a sort of a company by company basis as well as a total portfolio basis.
All right, I'm going to do a quick round, one more for each of you, and then we're going to go to the audience. In this strategy, there's a very interesting description of what happened with CellTel and investments that were made by CDC that ended up being fantastically successful, both in terms of the returns and the access to mobile, probably maybe quicker than would have happened regardless. What is the next CellTel? What is the thing that you are thinking about, Daniel, that you think is going to be the transformative investment sector in Africa in particular that CDC damn well better direct their money to in the next 5 years?
I think if I had that perfect a crystal ball, I may not be sitting at this chair right now. I'd be out running a company in Africa. If you step back for a second, I think one of the biggest challenges that the continent faces is access to power. So I think actually just the number of people that need access to reliable power and the sort of transformative effect that has, I think is incredibly important. And I think that goes for power, and I think from that you can also then talk about infrastructure more broadly. And so I think I touched upon briefly some of the stats around African infrastructure. I think working out how we can really move the needle, I'm talking that tackle, as Lord Bates said, that $2.5 trillion gap in infrastructure financing, particularly in the fragile states. I think that's where you can find both huge development impact and then also a really sustainable business model.
Good. Well, let us know when you find the answer. Rachel.
Same question?
Not the same question, but if you do know the answer, feel free to volunteer it. I was going to ask you a slightly different question, which is that for those of us who kind of cut our teeth in the era of thinking about debt forgiveness, we are back around at a question about whether debt levels are becoming unsustainable. I think that not only the DFID strategy, CDC strategy, more broader MDB strategies, I'm not sure whether they're fully taking account of some of the risks. What is your perception of the risks of there being too much debt growing again? And this is with other actors coming in as well, China and others, that are rebuilding us towards a place where we may start having debt problems again, and we know what that led to 20 years ago. So.
First and foremost, in relation to CDC, of course, any debt that CDC creates is lending for the private sector, and it's lending for the private sector proper. And CDC have really strong due diligence processes. So I hope that Nick and the chairman would agree with me that the debts that CDC are creating are not debts that will migrate to the sovereign balance sheets and not debt that would create the debt crises that we've spoken about before. And that's really important. It's really important to understand that we're investing in the private sector, in the private sector balance sheet. And in doing that, we're also very clear as we take these, if you like, these stories of investment through, that we're also really understanding the affordability for the consumer of a business. So, there's a real thread of responsibility through everything that CDC does. And I can tell you, we talk to CDC a lot about that and make sure that there is. So in terms also of the impact on consumers who are benefiting from the investments, we're also confident in terms of the approach that CDC takes. In terms of your wider question, we work very closely with the IFIs, with the IMF, and the World Bank, yes, there's a very important set of issues about absolutely understanding what contingent liabilities are being built up, particularly in sub-Saharan African balance sheets. Those are conversations that are happening at the highest levels, and there's a lot of effort now in the international system. Many of us are old enough to have been absolutely firmly engaged in the HIPC process, in the debt write-off. People feel it, they understand it, they're working on it.
Great, thanks. Nick, last one to you before we go out to the audience. I want to ask you a little bit of a same question that I asked Lord Bates. If you follow through on your strategy, you're going to end up with some losers on the balance sheet. And it's critical to doing what you're trying to do. What do you need from this audience, from the Parliament, and others to help you in your ability to continue to lead and push the boundaries while knowing that there are going to be bad stories out there?
Well, I think the question of bad stories and risk, I mean, you're absolutely right. CDC is an investment firm. It's our job to take risk. You take risk, you will have some winners and you have some losers. One of the things that I'm most encouraged about, having recently joined and sort of kicked the tires a little bit, is actually how high quality the portfolio actually is. Doesn't mean there aren't some problems in it, but as a general rule, I think the organization's done a terrific job particularly over the last 5 years, in putting money into places where there is significant developmental impact, but also at the same time that the money is backing the right people, the right companies, the right organizations. So I think in terms of what we can get from people in the audience, I mean, the question is, how do you minimize the risk? You'll never eliminate it. You minimize the risk by ideally knowing as much about the marketplaces that you're investing as you can, knowing as much about the issues you're trying to address, the problems. And I think there's many people in this audience that can help us better understand the countries and the areas and the sectors that we're involved in. So that's why, as I mentioned in my remarks, more engagement, more consultation, more collaboration, more partnership is a key part of our strategy over the next 4 or 5 years.